My name is Jenny. The courtroom was filled with a tense silence, broken only by the shrill scream of my stepmother, Ava. She's a fraud, Your Honor. A delusional little thief, she shrieked, her face contorted with rage. I sat there, unmoved. I folded my hands on the table in front of me, just as my grandfather, Henry, had taught me when I was 8 years old. He always said that a person's hands could reveal their true nature. Mine were steady, while Ava's were shaking so violently that her attorney had to place a hand on her wrist to calm her down. The judge, a wise-looking woman in her 60s with reading glasses pushed up into her silver hair, fixed a long, hard stare at Ava. Then, she slowly turned to Ava's attorney, a man in an expensive black suit that probably cost more than my first car. He was half standing, ready to object, but the judge's quiet voice cut through the air. Counselor, do you truly have no idea who this woman is? I watched as the color drained from the attorney's face in 2 stages. First, his cheeks paled, then the area above his collar. His mouth opened slightly, and I could tell he had no answer. It was clear he either hadn't done his homework or, more likely, Ava had told him not to bother. Ava turned to look at her attorney, then at me. For the first time in 12 years, I let her see the real me. Not the polite, submissive girl I used to be when I was 20, still hoping she'd accept me. I was now a forensic accountant with 5 years of experience at the state's financial crime unit. The moment she saw my face, her own went pale. It wasn't the dramatic kind of pale, but the kind that showed she was calculating the mess she'd gotten herself into. I'd been waiting for this day for almost half my life. My story begins when I was 7. My mother, Lily, died of breast cancer. It was a quick and cruel disease that took her before anyone could say all they wanted to. I hardly remember her, just the smell of her rose-scented perfume and the way she used to sing lullabies to me at night. I don't even remember her funeral. My father told me later that I sat in the front pew, holding my grandfather's hand, refusing to look at the casket. 14 months after my mother's death, my father, Robert, married Ava. She came into our house in Riverdale with a moving truck full of modern furniture and her 7-year-old son, Dylan. From the very start, she made it clear that things would be different. My mother's pictures came down from the walls, and the handmade blanket my grandmother had given me disappeared into a closet, never to be seen again. My father, who was 40 at the time and drowning in grief, didn't put up a fight. I think he was relieved to have someone else making decisions. I quickly learned that there were 2 types of children in our house: Dylan, who got the latest toys, the biggest bedroom, and trips to amusement parks, and me, who got the leftovers. Literally. Ava would cook a delicious meal on Sundays, and while Dylan ate at the table, I was given a bowl of cereal in the kitchen because she said I was a fussy eater and she didn't want to waste food on me. My father worked long hours at his architecture firm in the city. He came home tired and rarely noticed the way Ava treated me. When I tried to tell him that something was wrong, he'd pat me on the shoulder and say, "Jenny, she's trying her best. Give her time." He wasn't a bad man, but he was a coward. He let Ava run the house and treat me like an outsider. The one person who saw through Ava was my grandfather, Henry. He lived in a small town called Greenfield, about an hour and a half away. He had a beautiful old farmhouse with a red roof and a large garden. He'd been a tax accountant for 35 years before retiring. When my mother got sick, he was 70, and his only focus was on me. Every other weekend, from the time I was 8 until I was 19, my father would drive me to Greenfield on Friday afternoons and pick me up on Sunday evenings. Ava and Dylan never came. Those weekends were the only times in my childhood when I felt truly happy. Grandfather would be waiting on the porch, a glass of iced tea in his hand during the summer and a warm cup of cocoa in the winter. As soon as I got out of the car, he'd say, "There's my girl, the light of my life." He taught me how to play chess, how to fish in the small stream behind his house, and how to balance a checkbook when I was 10. When I was about 12, he started teaching me his real trade. One afternoon, he took me to his study and pulled down a large box from a high shelf. Inside were files, neatly organized in manila folders, each labeled with a different name. "Do you know what these are, Jenny?" he asked. I shook my head. "These are paper trails," he said. "Each one tells the story of someone trying to cheat others. And they all got caught because someone kept the receipts. Money has a memory, Jenny. It remembers where it came from and where it went, even when people try to hide it." He spent years teaching me. By the time I was 16, I could analyze a complex financial statement. By the time I graduated high school, I could trace money through multiple shell companies and document my findings in a way that would hold up in court. I went to college at the University of State, majoring in accounting. Then, I got my master's degree in forensic accounting from a well-known university. I passed my CPA and CFE exams on the first try. Grandfather was so proud, he drove all the way to the graduation ceremony and cried as he hugged me. 8 months after my graduation, Grandfather died of a heart attack in his sleep. I flew home for the funeral. Ava, my father, and Dylan were there. Dylan was 25 and already had a history of petty theft. None of them had visited Grandfather more than a couple of times in the past 10 years, and none of them shed a tear. Ava even checked her phone during the eulogy, and I felt a cold anger rise within me. After the funeral, Grandfather's attorney, Mr. Thompson, pulled me aside. He told me that Grandfather had updated his will 16 months before he died. The farmhouse, the land, the contents of his study, and all his investment accounts came to me directly. There were no trusts, no conditions, and no probate complications. He also left me a letter, which Mr. Thompson gave me in a sealed envelope and told me to read alone. The estate was worth just over $2,500,000 on paper. Most of it was the land, 70 acres of fertile farmland in Greenfield, which had increased in value over the years as the town developed. There was also the house, the savings accounts, and a valuable stamp collection that Grandfather had inherited from his father. I read the letter that night in my hotel room. It said, "Jenny, you were the best thing in my life. Take care of the land, take care of yourself, and remember what I taught you. People will try to take what's yours. Make sure your paperwork is in order. I love you more than words can say." 3 days later, Ava called me. It had been 5 years since the last time she'd called. Her voice was sickly sweet, the way it only was when she wanted something. "Jenny, honey, we need to talk about your grandfather's estate. It's a lot of money for a young woman to handle on her own, and that farmhouse needs a lot of upkeep. We were thinking it might be better to put the property in a family trust so we can all benefit." I let the silence stretch. Grandfather had taught me the power of silence. She filled the silence, saying, "Dylan has been having a hard time. Some equity in the property could really help him get back on his feet. And of course, we'd make sure you're taken care of, too." I closed my eyes and thought of Dylan, who had stolen my favorite necklace on my 22nd birthday. "Ava, the estate is settled. There's nothing to discuss," I said firmly. Her tone changed immediately. "We're your family, Jenny. Your father is grieving. You can't just cut us out." I replied, "Grandfather decided who he wanted to give his property to. I'm not going to question his decision. He was perfectly fine when I last spoke to him, just a few days before he died." And with that, I hung up. 2 months later, I was served with a lawsuit. Ava alleged that Grandfather had been of diminished capacity in the last 16 months of his life and that I had exerted undue influence over him to change his will. The so-called documented history of mental instability she used against me was a visit to a school counselor when I was 14. I'd been grieving my mother and being mistreated at home. The counselor's notes said I was going through a difficult time and could benefit from family counseling, but there was no diagnosis or medication. Ava had kept that record for 17 years, waiting for the right moment. I hired Mr. Thompson to defend the estate. I dipped into the savings Grandfather had left me to pay the legal fees, which was exactly what Ava was counting on. I spent my weekends in Greenfield, going through every single document grandfather had ever filed. I built a 980-page record of his mental state in the last 2 years of his life, including doctor's appointments, emails to his old clients, and the draft of a book he was writing. But the real fight began when I started looking into Ava's finances. As a forensic accountant, I had the right to access her financial records through the discovery process. What I found was shocking. Ava had been systematically draining my father's accounts for 16 years. She had power of attorney over his finances, which she'd obtained when my father had a minor surgery and was hospitalized. He had no memory of signing it and never revoked it. Over the years, she had transferred approximately $420,000 from his retirement accounts into a series of accounts she controlled. Most of the money went to support Dylan. His new apartment in the city, his luxury car, and his fake business, which had no real clients. My father, who was now 56 and starting to think about retirement, had no idea. He thought he was just spending his savings faster than expected. It got worse. I discovered that Ava had done the same thing to her own mother. I traced the money through 4 states. Her mother had died in a nursing home with almost nothing left, and Ava had been the executor of her estate. There were also 2 other elderly women in the community who had given Ava some financial control during their illnesses and had died with significantly less money than their families expected. I sat in grandfather's study one Saturday afternoon, surrounded by the evidence I'd collected, and cried. Not because I was sad, but because I realized that grandfather had been right all along. He had known there was something wrong with Ava from the first time he met her, and he had spent 12 years teaching me how to uncover the truth. That night, I called Mr. Thompson and told him what I'd found. "Jenny, this isn't just a probate case anymore. This is a criminal case," he said. I knew. We needed to bring in the state attorney's office, and I also knew I had to talk to my father. I drove to Riverdale on a Sunday morning. Ava was at church, and my father was alone in the kitchen, making coffee. He looked old, much older than 56. He looked like a man who hadn't slept well in a long time. I sat down at the kitchen table and laid out all the documents in front of him. I walked him through every single transaction. He didn't say a word for almost an hour. Then, he put his head in his hands and said, "Jenny, what have I done?" I said, "Dad, you didn't do anything. She did this. You didn't know." He started to cry, and I'd never seen my father cry before, not even when my mother died. After a long time, he said, "Will you help me, Jenny? Will you help me get out of this?" I said, "Yes." 3 months later, we were back in court. The hearing was supposed to be a status update on the probate case, but by then, we had filed a counter-petition. My father had hired his own attorney, revoked Ava's power of attorney, and filed for divorce. The state attorney's office had launched an investigation into Ava's financial activities over the past 16 years. Ava and her attorney walked into the courtroom that Tuesday morning expecting a routine hearing. They thought I was still the scared 8-year-old who used to eat cereal alone in the kitchen. But when the judge called the case, Ava stood up, wearing a designer suit and her mother's diamond earrings. She looked at me with contempt and shouted, "She's a fraud, Your Honor." That's when the judge asked her attorney, "Counselor, do you truly have no idea who this woman is?" My attorney, Mr. Thompson, stood up and said, "Your Honor, with the court's permission, my client would like to enter the following documents into the record." He passed a thick binder to the judge. The judge read for what seemed like an eternity. When she looked up, her expression had changed. She looked at Ava, her attorney, and me. "Miss Jennings, I've been on the bench for 20 years, and I've rarely seen a case as well documented as this. Counselor, do you wish to revise your client's earlier statements?" The attorney stood up, his face ashen. "Your Honor, I request a brief recess to confer with my client." The judge granted it, and there was a soft laugh from the gallery. When we returned, Ava's attorney asked to withdraw from the case, citing irreconcilable differences with his client. The judge granted his request. Ava sat alone at her table for the rest of the hearing. As the judge read the preliminary findings related to Ava's financial fraud, the federal investigation, and the divorce proceedings, Ava's face went through every color. She tried to speak, but the judge silenced her. She tried to stand up, but the bailiff stepped forward. 4 months later, Ava was indicted. She pleaded guilty to 8 counts of wire fraud and 1 count of elder financial abuse. She was sentenced to 12 years in prison. Dylan was also indicted on 4 counts of conspiracy and served 30 months in jail. My father moved into the farmhouse in Greenfield. He's lived there with me for part of every year since then. We don't talk much about what happened. He sits on the porch in the morning with his coffee, and I sit next to him. Sometimes he says, "Your grandfather would be proud of you, Jenny." And I say, "He'd be proud of you, too, Dad. You came back." The day Ava was sentenced, I drove back to my apartment and waited for the feeling of triumph, relief, or closure. But none of those feelings came. Instead, 2 weeks later, a long-held grief washed over me. Grief for my mother, for the childhood I never had, and for the father who had let me down but had finally come back. I started therapy. I went twice a week for almost 2 years. I cried in the therapist's office, on the bus, and in grandfather's study as I was cleaning it out. I let myself feel all the emotions I'd been suppressing for so long. I've learned many things from this experience. Silence is not a sign of weakness. Grandfather taught me to listen and wait, and Ava showed me who she was from the start. I just wasn't old enough to act on it then. Paperwork is a form of love. Every document grandfather kept was his way of protecting me. Those records were a love letter, the most practical one I've ever received. When someone tries to hurt you in public, don't react. Just wait. The truth will come out. And the silence of someone who knows the truth is louder than any scream. Family is not defined by blood. Grandfather was my family, and my father became my family again after he made amends. Ava and Dylan were never really family. If you're a young person in a situation where you're being mistreated, document everything. Keep a record of your life. You may not know why at the time, but one day, those records will be your greatest asset. I now run a forensic accounting firm in Riverdale, specializing in elder financial abuse cases. I've helped 20 families recover assets that were stolen from their elderly relatives. I do most of my work on a sliding scale, and I'm paid in gratitude, casseroles, and handwritten letters from people who have gotten their lives back. Every case starts the same way. I lay out the folders on the table, pick up a pencil, and look at the person across from me. I say, "Let me show you something." Paper trails don't lie. I think about grandfather every day. Not in the heavy way I used to, but in the small things. The way he taught me to hold a pencil, the way he said, "Let the silence work for you" before a tough conversation, and the way he labeled every folder by hand. He's been gone for 9 years, but his teachings are with me every day. In the end, everything we do is like planting seeds. Ava planted the seeds of her own downfall with every act of fraud. And the seeds grandfather planted in me grew into a woman who could face her in court and win. What we plant, we will eventually have to face.